So one of the questions I get a lot about dahlias is, where can you grow dahlias? And as an absolute dahlia addict, I'm here to tell you, almost anywhere. Hi everyone, I'm Erin the Impatient Gardener, and I'm here to tell you that as long as you can find a spot with at least part sun, we can find a spot for you to grow some dahlias. I think when people get into dahlias, they see these beautiful blooms, and as they sort of start following them, they land often at flower farms. And that's not surprising. Flower farms are growing amazingly beautiful dahlias. But flower farms typically grow dahlias in long rows because they are growing these flowers for production, to cut them and sell them and share them. That is not necessarily how you want to grow them as a gardener. So I tend to grow dahlias as regular garden plants, intermixed in the garden among other plants. But I also grow dahlias one other way, and this is definitely a great way to give them a try if you haven't already, and that is in containers. Yes, you can absolutely grow dahlias in containers, and I'm going to help you figure out how to do that today. So one of the really cool things about dahlias is that they come in so many shapes and sizes and colors and forms. It's pretty amazing, the enormous range of dahlias that are out there. And some of those are better suited for some types of container growing than others. So I think a lot of people discover dahlias when they see these enormous flowered ones. Sometimes these are called dinner plate dahlias because they're supposedly the size of a dinner plate. There's no doubt about it. These things are so impressive. However, one of the things to note about that kind of dahlia is that those plants tend to get very, very large. We're talking maybe 6 feet or taller. And they really don't produce that many flowers throughout the season. Generally speaking, the bigger the flower, the fewer flowers that plant probably produces throughout the season. This is a very general concept, and there are certainly exceptions to that. But when you see those really big ones, you might get 6 to 10 of those flowers in a summer. With some smaller ones or some single forms, you might get hundreds of flowers throughout the season. You might really just have a plant covered in flowers the whole time. So when it comes to maximizing the amount of flowering you're going to get through a dahlia in a container throughout the season, you want to be looking at sometimes single forms or shorter forms that are sort of bred specifically for front of the border or for containers, because those varieties tend to just keep pumping out flowers the whole season. But that doesn't mean you can't grow these really tall flowering varieties in containers. And in fact, some container displays use these to great effect. And those tend to be container displays that are large numbers of containers clustered together. This is something that is maybe not done as much in the United States as it is in other places, but if you go to gardeners like Klaus Dalby or you look at Great Dixter, they often create these massive displays that are small containers, and what they do is they swap things in and out of those displays, and that's where those really tall dahlias could actually really be really effectively used, because you could plant a dahlia in there, you can have that growing somewhere else, and then when it looks great you swap that into your container display, and when it doesn't look great you swap it out. But those really big, tall varieties are probably not the best choice if you're thinking about containers that you want to have sitting on your patio for the whole summer. So I briefly mentioned height, and that is a really big factor that you should really consider when you're choosing the right dahlia for a container. Because the bigger the dahlia, the more it needs to be staked. I find in my garden that at 24 inches and certainly 20 inches and below, I can generally get away without staking a dahlia. Once you get to that 24 to 30 inch range, you can do kind of a sort of what I consider to be a light staking, which is perhaps a small bamboo cane that you just kind of tie something to. When you get up to the really big guys, the ones that get 4 to 6 feet tall, you need to be thinking about a really significant staking system, which is either a very large post that you're going to tie things to. Sometimes I actually have 2 posts, and then I actually tie twine between them and sort of sandwich the stake between there. You might be looking at a tall tomato cage type of thing. These absolutely will not work if you don't stake them. So if you want to reduce the amount of work you have to do and the amount of staking you have to worry about, think shorter. So for many of you watching this video, right now is a fine time to be planting dahlias both in the ground or in a container. The general rule of thumb when you're planting dahlias is that you want the soil temperature to be at least 60 degrees. So for me here, it would be way too early to put those in the ground, but I live in zone 5B, 6A. We generally have very cold springs, and so I'm always behind everybody on that kind of thing. So it's much easier to reach that sort of 60-degree threshold. You do need to be thinking a little bit about nighttime temperatures. Honestly, I'd really love for my dahlias to not see nighttime temperatures below 50 degrees. That would be perfect. You can sort of push all these things. 45 degrees is fine. It's just in order to keep them growing and keep them moving. Nothing bad's going to happen unless we get down into, mid 30s. But you generally want to keep everything moving and growing once dahlias have woken up. So how should you plant dahlias in containers? Well, there's 3 ways to sort of start. So one of the ways I accomplish that is that I pot up my dahlia tubers early. Even doing that, things are very, very slow this year. There are some nice little growth tips coming up on this, and this should grow fairly quickly. I would say by the time you're watching this video, the time for potting up tubers ahead of time in order to then plant them in a container or in the ground for that matter is probably past. So if you haven't done this already this year, consider it for future years, but probably you're past the point where you're going to see any real returns on this method. Potting dahlias up early has 2 real benefits for me. One is that I tend to see them start flowering 2 to 3 weeks earlier than tubers that I plant in the ground. 2, I also tend to plant dahlias in with other plants, and so for me it's a lot easier to have an actual physical plant that can compete with the plants around it and that won't get shaded out by them. The other way is to buy a dahlia plant. More and more garden centers are carrying these. Some of these are things they grow from tubers themselves. Some are things that come from nurseries. This beauty right here, which is Mega Bloom Raspberry Ice, is definitely going to go in a container at the front of the house this year because this is a shorter growing variety. And I love that little white center on it. And isn't it fun to see a dahlia flower already? Probably the most economical way to grow dahlias, which is very easy, is to just plant tubers in pots. So dahlias have a bit of a reputation as a diva plant, but really they don't ask for much more than any other like flowering annual that you're going to put in a container. They like consistent moisture, and they want a little bit of richness and nutrition to their soil. That's really no different from most other things. But that does mean that you want to consider the size of the pot you plant them in. So if you're planting a single tuber, I would not go smaller than maybe a 14-inch pot. And bigger is probably better in most cases. This is an 18-inch pot, and we're going to put 2 tubers into this one. So you can absolutely mix dahlias with other plants in containers. In fact, that's probably my favorite way to grow them and the way I grow them the most often. If you're going to start from tubers planted right in the container that you're going to be growing them in, I think it's best to get your dahlias going first and then add in your other annuals after that, rather than have full flushed out annuals and then have to stick a tuber in there. And the main reason for that is that annuals, once they're going, they want that moisture right away. It's a little bit different for dahlia tubers. You don't want to overwater a dahlia tuber before it has a lot of growth going on it because you stand a chance of rotting that tuber then. Whatever pot you use, make sure it has holes on the bottom. You can see this one I've actually drilled additional holes into. You want really good drainage for dahlias. Never, ever, ever let them sit around soaking wet. Use a really good potting mix with good drainage in it. Fill up your container all the way with the potting mix. Don't put anything else in there with it. So I mentioned nutrition, and dahlias do like a really nutrient dense soil. So I'm going to add in an organic fertilizer here. This is a one specifically sort of meant for flowers, and it's got feather meal in it and some sort of micronutrients, and it looks like oyster shells, things like that. I'm going to put some of that in here and mix this in now. And the dog absolutely loves this stuff. So when you buy dahlias, sometimes you will get a single tuber, sometimes you'll get a clump like this one. So you plant tubers in containers the same way you plant them in the ground, which is about 4 inches below the level of the soil. Don't stress about this and start measuring. 2 inches is going to be fine, 6 inches is going to be fine. They're going to grow no matter what. Now you remember how I said don't stress too much about these. I also said I was going to plant 2 tubers in here, and it turns out I'm actually going to plant 3 in here, and that's because I know they're going to be fine. Now on this spindly guy, you could break this off altogether. You could cut it back to here with your fingers. You might break it off accidentally all the way. Again, don't worry about this. These are way easier than you think they are. I like to lay tubers on their side, just in that little hole that you've created. Cover them up. And that's all there is to it. Now because this is fresh potting mix and it was already because this is fresh potting mix and it came out of the bag sort of nicely moistened, I'm not going to add any water to this. I am going to leave this outside, so if it rains, it's going to get rained on, but I'm not going to add any water right now because there's moisture in this soil. Because the one thing you do have to worry about with dahlia tubers is if you get them too wet, and especially if it's cooler, those tubers can rot, and that's not what you want. So the variety I just planted here is called Honka, but I bought a mixture of them. So it's a series of dahlias and there's multiple colors in it, and this is a mix of them. So we don't know what's going to pop up here, which is why I actually put it in this bright turquoise pot, because I thought it actually could be a very fun sort of confetti-like display. Now this is actually a little bit taller growing variety. This is a variety that grows about 24 inches tall, maybe a little taller. So I will need to be staking these, and you can stake your dahlias right when you plant. You can put a cage in this right away. You can put stakes next to them. It's kind of a good idea sometimes so that you don't take a risk of spearing the tubers. I'm going to wait until these come up. I think in a container it's easy enough if you catch it before they really need to be staked, when the growth is about like this. I think as long as you catch it by then, when you can still easily stake it, it's no problem, and you can fashion whatever sort of staking method you need at that point. But I probably will need to be staking. Now since all of these had pretty clear growth points on them, I would expect to see some growth coming up here in a couple of weeks. Once I see a lot of growth, that's when I'll start watering this container, although this is going to be outside, so I will let rain get to it. So if it rains, it'll get some moisture. We've got good drainage, so it should be fine either way. When the dahlias get about maybe, 3 to 4 sets of leaves, I will pinch out the center of them down to about 2 leaves. And what that does is create branching. And especially in a container, you really want a lot of branching because that will help you get more flowers and a bushier plant. If you keep letting the dahlia grow without pinching it, you will get a very tall plant that's a little bit lanky. So for most gardeners who are growing dahlias to appreciate them as plants in a container or in their garden, the thing to do is pinch them out so that you get a nice bushy plant with really good branching, but basically what you're going to get is way more flowers. Throughout the season as this grows, absolutely give these things a liquid fertilizer like you would with other plants growing in a pot. I would think you could get away with a nice organic fertilizer if you're only growing dahlias. But if you're growing dahlias in container with other annuals, I have absolutely fed those with a synthetic fertilizer. They're fine. Don't worry about it. They are way more adaptable than we give them credit for. I guess what I'm trying to say here is don't sweat this too much. Dahlias are way easier than you think they are. The one bit of maintenance that you are going to want to do regularly on your dahlias, though, is deadhead them. So you can tell a flower bud, on a dahlia, you can tell a flower bud that is spent from a new one because the spent flower buds will be triangular. New flower buds that are emerging will be quite round. And then when you deadhead them, you cut down to where that stem is coming from at least. Sometimes you might even want to cut even deeper because you'll get additional branching. So I know what you're thinking. What about winter? What do we have to do with these for winter? If you're living in zone 8 or lower, or 7 or lower or colder, your dahlias are going to probably succumb to freezing, and they will die over winter if you leave them in this pot. So you have Three options. First one is you can dig them out of this pot and you can store them like you would with other dahlias. And I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but I have a lot of videos on this channel about how you store dahlias and dig them. You could also bring the whole pot inside, leave them right in the pot, bring it into your sheltered, cold, dark area and just let it dry down and store them right in there and bring them right back out in that same pot the next year. They'd probably be fine. Or, and this is an option I want you to think very strongly about, or you just let them die. I think we really need to start thinking about dahlias as annuals in a lot of cases. Unless you go down the road of really getting into specific varieties of dahlias that are sort of collector's types that can be a bit of an investment, dahlias are often no more expensive than any annual you buy, and certainly no centerpiece annual that you would buy at a garden center. And most of us don't think a thing about tossing those out every year. We just say, well, they've done their thing, we've enjoyed them, and then we let them go to the compost. That is a perfectly valid thing to do with dahlias, and I think we need to start thinking of them that way. Just because you can save a plant doesn't mean you should, or certainly that you have to. Consider just thinking of these as fun annuals and move on. You like them, you buy them again next year, just like you do with all of your other annuals. So now that you know how to grow dahlias in containers, even if you live in a small space, as long as you have part to full sun, the world is your oyster. Go plant some dahlias in a container, in the ground, wherever you go. You're gonna love them, I promise. All right, have a great day in your garden. Plant some dahlias. See you soon. Thanks to flowerbulb.eu for partnering with me on this video. Go to flowerbulb.eu for inspiration and education about all things bulbs.